can't you just be normal?
Exactly. A man your age has still no girlfriend? People have been talking. You better marry a girl to save our faces.
Mom, Dad, I've told you, I like men.
How can we face your grandparents, your uncles, your aunties if they find out our only son is gay? Do you want us to be the laughing stock of the family?
We sacrificed everything just to raise you, and yet this is how you repay us? By ending the bloodline?
I didn't choose this. You don't get how painful this is. Am I wrong for something I cannot change? Welcome to Performing Manhood, Queer Men, Marriage and Masculinity in China. I'm Sarita and I'll be your host. Today, we are exploring how queer men in China cope with family pressure and masculinity norms. What you just heard reflects that reality many queer sons face in Chinese families, where they may be called abnormal, pressure to marry a woman to protect the family's face, and expected to prioritize duty over themselves. Caught between stigma, safety, and love for their parents, many are choosing silence or difficult compromises to survive. So today in this podcast, we will explore 3 coping methods shaped by family expectation. Conversion therapy, the first one, which is tries to change a person's sexuality, and Hongqi marriage, which is the gay man marry a straight and heterosexual wife, and sequence as well as lavender marriage between gay men and lesbian women. And if that private pressure wasn't enough, the public environment is also shifting. Just recently this month, Apple removed the 2 of China's top gay dating apps, Blue and Finca, from the Apple stores after an order from the Cyberspace Administration of China, the National Internet Regulator and Censorship Authority. So what does this mean for the future of LGBTQ plus community in China, or queer men in China? To help us unpack this, we've invited 2 distinguished guests. And first, we'll have Dr. Lin, a socialist who researches gender, sexuality, and state power in contemporary China.
Hi Sarita, thanks for having me.
We're also joined by Dr. Chen, a clinical psychologist who worked closely with LGBTQ plus community and on the mental health impacts of familial social pressure.
Hi Sarita, happy to be here.
Doctors, welcome. It's nice to have you both here. Let's just quickly get back to the recent news of the pushback against the LGBTQ plus community in China. Dr. Lin, what does that tell us about how the Chinese state thinks about masculinity and sexuality? Could you give us a little context about homosexuality in China and the mainstream attitudes?
My pleasure. So what we have to understand here is that China adopts a results-oriented model of governance. In political science, we call it pragmatic authoritarianism. Basically, the state prioritizes stability, economic growth, and demographic goals over individual rights. Anything that may destabilize society, like mass movements of a visible LGBTQ plus community, is treated as a risk that ought to be suppressed. Hence, when these queer dating platforms become more influential, the state cracks down on these because they may engender broader social movements. But there are other factors to the anti-homosexuality in China as well. A legacy of Maoist China, gender and sexual expressions are still almost exclusively defined by heteronormative reproductive roles.
So we can look at conversion therapy. Although the 2013 mental health law prohibits treating someone without a mental disorder, there is a gray area surrounding the definition of homosexuality, as the Chinese classification of mental disorders defines it as a sexual orientation disorder. So public hospitals and clinics may still use electroshock therapy, forced medication, and confinement to cure queer people, even in major cities, according to a report from Human Rights Watch. Worse still, authorities rarely enforce the law against these hospitals.
Gosh, then is conversion therapy still a practice that is prevailing?
Yes, unfortunately. However, I also want to bring to attention brighter examples about this topic. So I recently interviewed a gay participant who was forced by his parents to undergo diagnosis and therapy for being homosexual in Fujian province, a region known to particularly value family ideals in mainland China. So what's interesting is the doctor still did not push for any treatment even when his homosexual orientation was confirmed. Instead, the doctor surprisingly only urged his parents to accept their son.
Oh, that's such a relief then. I truly hope things are getting better these days.
There's an increasingly common sentiment amongst the Chinese population. So my research surveying the attitudes of the Chinese population towards gay conversion therapy actually reflects growing awareness. So 40% of participants supported a full legal ban.
Well, I think it's really encouraging to see more people recognizing how harmful practices like conversion therapy are. But progress doesn't look the same everywhere, does it? Because recently I've come across a podcast from BBC World Service about why people in China are looking online for a marriage buddy and pretending to be married. And discovering that it was all to meet societal expectation, it was really sobering. Could you tell us more about this?
My pleasure. So what you just described would be 新婚, which translates to cooperative marriage or contract marriage. And it's indeed on the rise amongst young 同志 in mainland China. There's a saying in Chinese, 家和万事兴, meaning harmony in the family leads to prosperity in all undertakings. I believe Dr. Chen can say much more about this with his research.
Thank you, Dr. Lin, for the shout out. But yes, across the interviewees for my research, I did notice a trend of gay men coming out to their mother first, or to their mother exclusively, or that their mother was more prone to quietly accepting them as opposed to their fathers. However, what's even more prominent is that many of these coming out confessions are actually not done voluntarily, or at least actively. Much of this could be linked back to what you previously mentioned, Dr. Lin, the idea of maintaining harmony and peace in the family as an utmost priority in Chinese culture. So I would like to share a recording from my interviewee.
To go meet him, I wanted to see him. And my mom got kind of mad at me, sort of, because she was like, you only spend time with that friend of yours, and she thinks that like I'm hiding something from her. But she knows what's happening, like she knows.
He came out informed too only because his mother discovered his messages with his boyfriend. So many of these coming out confessions in China are actually not done voluntarily, or at least actively. But also, of course, the emotional and social risk of coming out under the heteronormative Chinese environment are extremely high. Hence, coming out often happens only when they are forced into it, and even then, it's usually a last resort rather than a choice.
That's a shrewd observation, Dr. Chang. If I may, I can explain the phenomenon with traditional Chinese ideologies. Particularly Confucian thought has long since put a family at the core and terms filial piety and loyalty to the family above all else. And as mentioned, since Confucianism equates reproduction with filial piety, coming out as queer effectively declares oneself to be unfilial. Hence, in contemporary China, where Confucian values and other traditional, mostly conservative beliefs are so entrenched in society, the LGBTQ+ community is essentially invisible in the public scene because homosexuality is not merely viewed as a personal moral failure, but more so of a collective failure on the family's part, in terms of parenting, civility, but also reputation, social damage that would last generations.
Sadly, yes, and that's why there is a tongqi phenomenon in China right now. Some gay men knowingly enter these marriages that they're engaging in deceit, but others do so simply because they don't even know what homosexuality is. Either way, the outcome is tragic. I actually have a case study included into my research paper that exemplifies this. In the backward villages of central China, most people have never even heard of the word homosexuality. So Wei Lianghe, who lives in the rural area of Hainan province and only realized he liked men after being instructed by parents to enter into a heterosexual marriage, admitted in a 2017 interview that if I have to sleep in the same bed with her, it hurts. I wish the bed were wider, that there were more space between us.
You're right on the phenomenon of tongqi marriages ending in tragedy for both wife and husband. However, perhaps the news that invokes more relief is that there is an increasing community of tongqi support groups across China. For example, a support group in Shenzhen named Weichun Girl Tongqi Rescue Studio currently has around 960 million members. As you can see, the prevalence of this social practice is extremely high.
Oh my god, I can't imagine how great the pain would be for the tongqi, living in a lie and possibly having an identity crisis as well after discovering the truth. There must be another way for Chinese queer individuals to navigate marriage pressure where there's less harm to both themselves and to the other person, right?
So that's another thing that the Chinese queer community is addressing, and they have actually come up with another tactic to navigate these pressures. This is 新婚 marriages in China. So according to the survey results in my research, 82% of respondents think 新婚 is ethical depending on the situation, which tells us people see it as a way for queer men to perform expected masculinity, which is having a family of one's own, conforming to societal norms rather than challenging it, and keeping the family's face intact. It's another example of how masculinity becomes a tool to negotiate survival, not just in broader society where the majority is heterosexual, or even within the queer community.
Aptly put, Dr. Chen. However, we should still note that homosexual men who enter Tongqi marriages usually do not understand their sexuality, or apart from the older generation where the landscape was much more hostile, or come from rural areas where conservative values are too strong and dominant over their lives, that they are also forced into these marriages due to stigma and pressures to procreate. So when Tongqi marriages are heavily criticized, it actually harms queer rights in turn, as this reinforces the concept of marriage to be solely heterosexual. I think using honesty as an ethical yardstick in determining the legitimacy of a marriage is a double standard that only puts queer individuals in a bind when honesty is not held to the same standard in heterosexual marriages. This also potentially further widens the distance between heterosexuality and homosexuality. Because love does not have to be the only foundation of marriage. In fact, marriage has been used as an economic tool for eons.
That's such a valid point to bring out. Now looking back, many heterosexual marriages were not formed on the basis of love, but more of economic and political stability. I want to get back to your previous statement, Dr. Chen, on how masculinity becomes a tool to negotiate survival. Apart from entering Xinhua marriages, how else do queer men in China perform masculinity to navigate societal pressures?
That's a good question, Sarita. So, queer men in China tend to practice various social conforming and assimilation tactics, and it's true that more conventionally masculine gay men are more readily accepted by society. These gay men tend to be high achieving, straight presenting, and physically well built, fitting in the conventions of masculinity in China. So this reduces social stigma around them because society thinks, well, he's gay, but that's his only quote unquote flaw. So he's still good looking, strong, and rich.
If I may, Dr. Chen, I believe our colleague, Dr. Travis Kong, wrote an excellent book on this in 2010, where he discovered through his field study that the most desirable queer men are usually those who fit the criteria of hegemonic masculinity the most, where they exhibit all the prominent characteristics and attributes which are the typical cultural definitions of being a man. Endorsing hegemonic masculinity then engenders and perpetuates the formation of hierarchy and masculinities, which naturally leads to the stigmatization of other forms of masculinity that deviate from the ideal, the quote-unquote sissy men, gay men, etc.
Now that you mention it, I seem to recall seeing Xinhua ads where there's this huge emphasis and focus on the other partner having to exhibit conventional gender expression, which is something along the lines of feminine lesbian or masculine gays. It's also true that it's not that healthy for the community and the society, right?
Yes, Sarita, thank you for bringing that point out. One of my colleagues, Liu, discovered that they themselves distanced from the queer community to present themselves as more desirable candidates for Xinhua. Another social strata and consideration also enters this negotiation. Would you like to guess what it is?
Given that we're talking about marriage now, and that these Xinhua seekers seem to have quite the traditional concepts of marriage and gender roles themselves, it might be, is it something related to money, about how much the man earns?
Bingo. Another argument that these sequence seekers have are related to economic status and class, where not only do they reject queer subjects who do not practice traditional gender expressions, but they similarly reject those who do not reach a certain level of economic stability. Huang and Bauer, their 2018 paper revealed that queer subjects who cannot meet the class expectations in Xinhua are marginalized or even rejected access to such a queer practice. But this is not merely a class problem. It is more so a societal problem because reinforcing class effectively means reinforcing capitalism and the patriarchy. Class then aggravates the strictures of patriarchy and its exclusionary power, further reinforcing gender stereotypes as well as erasing visibility and sexual identities of lower income queer men, which in China is also strongly linked to the rural-urban divide.
Right, the intersection between patriarchy and capitalism has been a hot research topic in academia as well, and especially when you add queerness into the equation. Well, patriarchy relies on a rigid gender binary to legitimize men's dominion and power over women, which endorses the capitalist system by making women economically dependent on men.
Yes, and that is why class comes into play when reinforcing these harmful systems that marginalize queer identities. You, hopefully, are also independent, born in 1980 or later, at least a bachelor's degree, above average looks, not manly, easy to be with, and filial to both parties' parents. We see how Xinhuan as a social practice adopted by queer individuals to elevate societal and familial pressures end up ultimately building an even more toxic culture against our community.
Exactly. Class and capitalism thus proves to be another troubling dimension for queerness. We see gay men of higher socioeconomic status attempting to achieve citizenship via consumption and usually align themselves with cosmopolitanism, modernization, and negotiate respect and social standing with their spending power.
This idea is also elaborated in Ning and Guo's 2022 article where their research demonstrated that queer individuals in China use suzhi discourse to legitimize and justify their marriage and relationship decisions. Suzhi means quality or being civilized in Chinese. Queer men practice masculinity, which has been associated with suzhi due to the heteronormative landscape of China to gain social capital. Aside from masculinity, they differentiate themselves from the sexual promiscuity of Western queer culture and aim to present themselves as more committed to long-term relationships to reduce AIDS-related stigma. With this dynamic being sustained, where queer men with higher socioeconomic status endorsing in this capitalist consumerist culture, and the lower income queer men staying closeted, indirectly or directly, heteronormativity and homophobia is perpetuated.
So queer men are essentially playing by the rules of the system to survive within it, but with a cost and a compromise, right?
Exactly. So you see, the queer community stigmatizes feminine gay men. According to Zhang's research in 2023, gay men in China who self-identify to have a higher affinity with traditional gender roles significantly preferred feminine male voices. Yet the broader trend is that they prefer masculine male voices. So this shows that more conservative queer men treat feminine men as the woman in a relationship, enforcing heteronormative values even in the same-sex relationship.
So masculinity and soldier are entwined, which is why some choose to appear masculine and even enter into Xinhun. But what about Hongqi marriages? Older gay men prefer this over staying single, right?
Well, for older gay men who are born in the 60s, they treat heterosexual marriage as the main thread of life, while homosexuality is just a play. As Shen described in his 2025 investigation interviewing old queer men in Shanghai, older queer men view homosexuality as just a hobby and a dish rather than your staple food.
Oh, so for older gay men, romantic love isn't really a marriage concern, but a social obligation. That's an interesting phenomenon. Now, we focus a lot on the individual and relationship aspects of gay men's life, but I want to zoom out a bit. How do gay men perform straightness and masculinity in broader society? Let's say in the workplace, for example.
Well, the gay men are able to code switch, as mentioned by one drag queen in mainland China. He also said similar things, which I quote, "I still need to live a life just like other normal people, and in that life, I go to work every day and have to fake myself as a straight man to get me an easier life in the workplace. It's not like I want to, I am forced to." So he told us that it's my duty to act straight in professional settings, not out of fear, but because that's what expected. So as you can see from his quotes, that's survival logic.
This is something that I observed. But it seems to me that although gay men are only performing to be heterosexual in the workplace, they may have, ironically, repeated heteronormative dynamics with relationships.
That's a good observation, which links back to the previously discussed research. Even though many queer men reject the idea that there must be a man and a woman in a gay relationship, their behavior often contradicts this. There's this top and bottom sexual dynamic in gay relationships where tops are often coded as more masculine, dominant, wealthier, while bottoms are coded as more feminine, nurturing, and sometimes even less economically secure. So even when queer men are challenging heteronormativity by loving other men, they may still practice heteronormativity in how they distribute power in relationships.
So, just to sum up what we have discussed, masculinity becomes a negotiation tool which is used to survive, adapt, or subtly resist traditional norms and expectations. So, we are coming to the end of our episode. But before we end, let's look into what we have discussed so far. First, we looked into how queer men constantly balance family duty, social norms, and personal identity through tongqi marriages, coming out decisions, 新婚, and even conversion therapy. Then, we explored how masculinity becomes a negotiation tool for queer men to protect themselves in the heteronormative Chinese society, which is at work in the family, even within the queer community. Moreover, we looked into how this reproduces hierarchies and endorsing systems that harm the queer community, feminine men, tongqi, and anyone who can't perform proper manhood. But understanding where we are now leads to a bigger question. Where do we go from here, and what kind of changes can we expect?
To be honest, progress is looking slow, especially with the state cracking down on LGBTQ plus content and anything that remotely differs from the state's traditional masculine ideals. We see this from the 2021 ban on sissy men in the media, and now the recent removal of gay dating apps on the App Store. Meanwhile, we still have a society with deeply rooted Confucian ideals and rampant homophobia. We're still experiencing the after effects of the one-child policy, where more familial pressure is put on only child households and the state being concerned with boosting birth rates rather than protecting queer rights by having robust legislation and enforcement to ban conversion therapy. Moreover, hegemonic masculinity still remains to be a tool for social capital because patriarchy and capitalism are still dominant systems that don't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. Heteronormativity in China and the survival tactics that queer men adopt prove to be reminders of the existing structural barriers to queer progress.
Well, that's the sobering reality, but I don't think we should end there, because even within these constraints, there is hope and concrete steps for different actors to take. Firstly, the Chinese government should strengthen crackdowns on conversion therapy and introduce anti-discrimination policies in employment and healthcare. Secondly, private companies can offer relocation or travel support for employees who marry abroad. We've seen similar examples like Alibaba and the LGBT dating app Blued organizing a contest to send 10 same-sex Chinese couples to the US for legal marriages. As for the education system, homophobic content should be removed from textbooks, like psychology manuals saying gay people can be fixed by shocks and surgery, according to some of my interviewees. Last but not least, allies make a big difference, be it parents, friends, colleagues. It's important to recognize that many men in tongqi marriages are victims of their time and context. That doesn't erase the harm to their wives, but we must also understand these marriages historically, not only morally. Parents should also realize that filial piety is not about controlling your child's life, but rather mutual care. So there's a line I often share with my patients: it never hurts to try. If we never try, we never know. So we may not see full legal equality very soon, but if each generation pushes a little, we can build a safer space for everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Lin and Dr. Chen, for such an honest and nuanced conversation. This has been such an insightful dive into queer men in China and their realities, as well as exploring the government's forces over them. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the next podcast episode.